Okay, welcome to our meeting on presenting scientific research and refining your research to get it ready for presentations. This is part 2 of our research seminar phase, and this is following our previous research seminar that showed how to work through your project, so the execution phase. We're now entering what's going to become the presentation phase, and over the next 2 meetings, we're going to be refining your presentation so that it gets it ready for the school fair and the upcoming fairs next semester. So here's a slide on what kind of results you need to be looking for. When you're doing your project presentation, when you're doing your project, right now at this phase, you should be looking at, you should be done with the actual creation of your project, whether it's an engineering project or your method, and you should start looking into actually testing and looking at the results of your experiment. So when considering your project, you need to, when you're doing your testing, you need to look at exactly how to lay out your testing. This includes looking at variables and different types of response indicators, like results in different scenarios that you can look at. And when you plan out how you're collecting data after you've created your system, the more intense and more complex and more thought out that your data is, the better your results and explanation is going to be.
Okay, so this is the data analysis. So if you guys at this point, you should be mostly done with your experimentation, or if you're not done with your experimentation, you should at least have an idea on how you're going to start and how you're going to complete your execution, right? So today we're going to go into data analysis. So you have all the numbers, and if you don't, that's completely okay. It depends on when your deadline is. Okay, it completely depends on when your deadline is. But we're just going to go into how you should analyze your data and interpret your results. So the first thing that we typically want to incorporate are statistical methods, and there's some different things that we can do for statistical methods. There's t-tests for significance, z-tests, and other various tests and other jargon that we can use to actually analyze the data you have. And we want to have 2 different types of data. If you've been to science class, you should know the difference with qualitative data and quantitative data. We want to be keeping track of both qualitative and quantitative data because that looks really good to the judges. And on quantitative data, that's numbers, right? So we have statistics, which are based off of a sample of data that you collected during your experimentation. And then you're going to have to use the specific metrics that you use to gauge your results, and there's going to be some different metrics that you can use. And it really depends on your whole experiment. If you're experimenting the percent output of a certain chemical, then you would use percent abundance or expected results versus what you actually got. And then accuracy and precision. Does everyone here know the difference between accuracy and precision? No? Okay. So accuracy is how close you are to your intended result or goal, and it's essentially comparable to how close you are to hitting a bullseye on a target. And then precision is how precise or precision is how precise. Your precision is how well your measuring is. How specific your measuring actually is. 0.001 inches has a greater precision than 0.01 inches. Does that make sense?
So if you have multiple different shots at a bullseye, an accurate shot would be one that's closer to the bullseye, but precise shots would mean that all of your shots are in one central area.
Yeah.
So it could be non-accurate but still precise, or it can be non-precise but still accurate. So going back to the quantitative and qualitative data, quantitative data is your numbers, but that's going to be mainly displayed on your board and your logbook and your binder. That's really raw data that you've processed and you've put into statistics and data analysis techniques. And that's going to allow you to show results in numbers, in graphs, in tables that a judge can see. Qualitative data are observations, and these are mainly things you're going to be talking about. So when a judge asks you about experimentation or your results, you do mention the quantitative stuff, the important data, but you also mention qualitative observations that you've made that verify those quantitative results, as well as prove that you've done the research yourself.
Yeah.
And then going off of statistical analysis, there's 2 main areas that you might want to incorporate into your studies. Descriptive includes an analysis of the actual data that you've received. So if you are doing cancer research about a neural network that can identify certain malignant tumors in cancer in images, then given the sample data that you had, descriptive statistics will look at how well your model did on this specific data set, and you're going to create metrics like standard deviation and mean and average, and mean and median and mode and stuff like that. That's specific to that sample set. But inferential is something you're going to be talking about more than writing about. It's going to be how does my research on this sample size project to a bigger thing. So if I've only tested the neural network on this set of specific cancer cells, making a generalization towards a very broad statement like that this neural network helps diagnose breast cancer would be inferential statistics. So having really good descriptive statistics, meaning a bigger sample size or really good statistical analysis, will allow you to make more valid inferential analysis.
Yes. And then something I want to briefly touch on is the statistics that you generate should be contributing to your ability to draw a conclusion. So the statistics that you should get should either support or disprove your hypothesis and support your question or your research purpose. But another thing you can do with your data is look for trends in your data. For example, last year when I did my project about specific drugs when designing for cancer, I found some type of trend where the increased molecular weight of the drug often decreased the ligand efficiency. And that's just a bunch of jargon, but basically the bigger it got, the worse it got. And so that's something you can show to your judges that you actually looked closely through your data and compiled everything. And overall, it's just a really important add-on factor that can allow your judges.
So when you're entering the presentation phase of your research, you want to be looking at how these competitions work. Because if you can break down how these competitions work, you can really create your presentations to tailor to those different parts. So in every competition, there's always a prejudging phase. So before your competition starts, you have to set up your board, and there'll be a time period where you're not there at your board. So if you're at the Plano ISD District Fair, you place your board beforehand, the day before, and the day after you come to present. And in that day, judges are looking at four main things: the logbook, the abstract, the binder, and the board. And what we say is the abstract is the most important first-hand thing that judges are going to be looking at. We'll do a more detailed analysis on how to write an abstract next meeting, but the abstract is going to be your entry point into your project. A judge should be able to read your abstract and understand every single part of your project in general terms. So they need to it needs to go over things like the background, the importance, the methodology, the results, and the conclusions. The format that we like to use for things like the abstract and the paper is IMRAD: introduction, materials and methodology, results, analysis, and discussion. And discussion is the same as the conclusion. So along with the abstract, you're also going to be putting your logbook, binder, and board. And your main display is going to be your logbook, binder, and board. Your logbook is, like we said in previous meetings, it's more of a journey through your experiment. You're going to be putting rough ideas in there, and you need to keep up with this logbook as you go throughout your presentation, as you go throughout your project, because if you do it all in one night, judges can see that. And also the quality of your logbook isn't going to be as good. And then binder is more of a formal report of your project. It's really similar to the logbook. It's a formal report of your project. It's really similar to the logbook, but it's all put into typing and graphs, and you can see it's basically your binder put into your board put into a binder. And then your board is your binder projected out. It's put with infographics and visuals that make it easy for a judge to understand your project from a visual standpoint. So this prejudging phase is way more important than you think. If you don't make these components really good, the initial first-hand viewpoint of your judge, the first impression, can be a little bit lower than expected.
Okay, so I just want to make two quick comments. First, about the logbook. You should already have started this logbook, and you should already have some hypothesis, basic procedures, and your some basic entries already established in that logbook. If you don't, I would get started on that as soon as you can, because this really wants to be like a development, and you want to have as much content as you can as possible. And the second is the importance of first impressions. A lot of judges, they're very preoccupied and they have a lot of things to do, so when they go judge, they want to be able to see your project and automatically know whether or not your project is going to be good when it comes to the interview phase. So you want to make these 4 components as solid as possible, so when the judges come up to you, they have that first impression that, oh, this is probably going to be a really good project. But then it comes to actually making that impression in the interviews. And this can be really intimidating because sometimes the judges have like 4 PhDs and like know everything, right? But the importance of the judging interviews is to be natural and present your project the way you know it the best. So a good structure for an interview is you first have something called an elevator pitch. And that's like an introduction to your entire project where it's not essentially memorized, but you should have like an outline of what you're going to say in this elevator pitch. And then you would have like, oh, for example, you would start out with the background or why you researched into this problem. Then you would go into what you did in the project and what you hypothesized. Then you would go into your results and then your conclusion. It's just like a very simple setup for the rest of your project. After your elevator pitch, they go into questioning. Oftentimes judges vary. Sometimes the judge asks you a question in the middle of your elevator pitch. Other times the judge just lets you talk for the entire time. But then the judge goes into questioning. And this is where practice really comes into play because judges can ask you anything. One time, last year, for example, my judge asked me what a bond was, like a chemical bond, which is something I was completely not prepared for because my project was like something kind of different from that. And so it's really important that you get practice and be prepared for everything that the judge is going to ask you. But typically if a judge is like a seasoned judge or like a judge with some common sense, then they're going to ask you like basic questions about your project. And if you missed anything in your elevator pitch, the computer just went to sleep. If you missed anything in your elevator pitch, then that's where they're going to clear things up. And the number 1 rule is to have confidence in this interview. Because the interview is not just the judge looking at your information, the judge is looking at how well you compose yourself and how well you believe that your project is better than the other projects. If you have some incredible project that could potentially revolutionize the world, but you talk like this and the judge can't hear you, and then the judge is really confused on what you say because you don't explain it very well, then that's not going to have as great of an impact as, let's say, some kid who has a simpler project but clearly outlines the steps that he has for his project and clearly outlines the implications for his project. And it's like a balance between appeal and content, and practicing through the interview is going to make sure that you get like the perfect score. Speaking of score, there's a certain rubric that we use at the competition, and Alay can go more into the rubric.
Right, so these rubrics they're pretty much similar for every single competition you'll go to, especially for the board competitions. And one thing before we go into the rubrics to note, at these competitions, if you get first place, you usually go to some kind of grand prize judging, and that's where you do the whole judging interviews again, but with more advanced judges against more advanced projects. And then the rest will proceed into further competitions. But to look at these rubrics, I won't go into too much depth because you can find these on our website. We'll put this up, as well as the DRSEF website. That's drsef.org. But basically, here's a science rubric, and it goes into exactly how many points are allotted. Yeah, turn on the light. It goes into exactly how many points are allotted to each of the different components of your presentation. So up here, you'll see that there's 10 points given to the purpose, the contribution to the field, and the scientific method. So that's kind of your introduction. Data collection and variables and controls, that's that's 15 points. Reproducibility, everything results and execution based, that's 20 points. But if you skip down, the most important thing at a combined 35 points is everything presentation. So you can see that we put a lot of emphasis in our curriculum on presentation because in these competitions, the rubric highly favors the presentation. That includes both how your poster is laid out, which we'll go into more depth later in this presentation, as well as next seminar, as well as the interview, which is how you're talking, your elevator speech, as well as answering those questions. So if you want to look at this rubric, as well as here's the engineering rubric, you can find it online. But it'll go through exactly what you need to mention in your presentation. So like the engineering rubric is different from the science rubric in that you need to mention things like what are the alternatives to your thing. If you have created a prototype that's solving a certain problem, what other prototype or what other device is doing the same thing that you've outlined. And then also you need to look at, like, for example, things like the creativity are the same throughout the two, but there's different things that you need to look at. And if you have a mix between a science and an engineering project, which I did over the past few years, you need to be able to mark off every single box in both the engineering rubric and the science rubric, because you don't really know which one they're going to use.
Alright. So now I'm going to talk about the research board, and it's really like there's a few common misconceptions about the actual board itself. So I'm going to start with the misconceptions. 1, the research board should not include every single part of your project and every single like sentence of your research binder. It should not be like paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs of information. 2, a bigger board means a better board. That is not true at all. When I was in 7th grade, I had this huge board and it didn't help me at all. So a lot of judges typically prefer like a smaller, like one size board, and that helps you be more concise. So those are the 2 big misconceptions about the board. So now I'm going to go into like what you should do in the board. The first thing that you should do in the board is include a lot of pictures and include a lot of diagrams that show like a clear flow of the information and present the information in a visually appealing way. So one of the easiest places that we can implement this is in the procedure. In the procedure, we want like a flow chart sort of thing, where you have pictures and arrows, and like simple sentences explaining the steps that you took, rather than a list of all the steps that you did. And that list should be found in your research binder, but on the board, we don't want to have those kinds of like long paragraphs on your board. And then, for example, in the future applications section of the board, you don't want to have like a solid paragraph of information, because even though you do have a paragraph of information, let's say in your research binder, instead on the board you could have like pictures of what like fields that this research can be applied in, and pictures of how, or like diagrams of how, what further steps that the researcher can take in order to implement this at a larger scale. And then the second one is having a shorter board. So some students or some competitors, they usually have a lot of information, or some just want to look good to the judges. So they're going to have 1, 1.5, or 2 boards stacked up on top of each other and try to fill out the whole thing. But the problem with this is that, 1, sometimes kids don't have enough information to actually put on 2 boards. So they're going to have like a 2 board, and like the first half of the entire board is the title. And then it's like just super empty and like really ugly, and honestly not a good presentation overall. And then other times, they do have like 2, right? But they have so much information jam-packed into one board that every single part of the double board setup is just solid text and solid like tiny little pictures that they have of all the information and all the data and all the graphs that they made throughout the entire project. So 1, we want to try and compile your board presentations into 1 board, or at the most 1.5, and we want to try to cut down on the information that you have on the board. Your board should be really concise and should be able to get the message across, and without adding a bunch of extra jargon or fancy words or things that don't contribute a lot to your project. I don't have a picture example here, but just kidding, we do have a picture example.
So before we get into actual examples of project boards, here's kind of like a layout as what there should be. Purpose, question, hypothesis, and variables. This is kind of introductions. And what we do like to also have here is materials and procedure are down here, but we kind of like to have it on this side. So on this side of your board, you should have an introduction as well as your materials and methodology. In the center,
usually we have this up here.
Yeah, it's in the center. It's mainly data, data, results, graphs, tables, images, all of that stuff, diagrams and photos should go here. And then on this side is your discussion and analysis and results. So that's a really basic way of putting it, and we'll put a better diagram up on the website later that you can follow. But here are some example boards. These are my example boards that I've taken to a few different competitions. Yeah, you should probably put it on the website. You can't really see with much detail, but I guess that's fine. This is the one that I took to state one year and the 2 national conferences. So here I have like, these 2 are this is my introduction. So that gives you an introduction to the problem, like what's wrong with neurodegenerative disorders and the current diagnosis. Eye movement types, this is the background. So if there's any kind of really important terminology or idea or methodology that you're going to be using throughout your board, you need to include that. So this kind of goes into the background or the introduction, just at the beginning, so that if they're reading it like up to, from here and down and then this way, usually they'll read from this side to that side, then they know what these terms mean before you use them in your results and analysis. And then all here, I have an entire, what is it called, section allotted to my creation of my tool, or my procedures. And I have simple things like flowcharts and images, so that make it really easy for the judge to follow how I'm doing it. You usually don't want to, you don't want to put a step-by-step thing. You can put step-by-step in things like a flowchart, but you don't want to have 1, 2, 3 all the way to 35 on your board given your procedure, because that becomes a bad thing. And then in the middle, I have everything data. And you can see there's really little words associated with the data. It's more graphs. And then underneath the graphs, there's like short explanations of what you're seeing. And what this does is it makes it really easy for a judge to see what is important in these graphs. So like up here, I have these simple graphs, and I do give an explanation on how to read these graphs. So if your graphs are shown as confusing or they look like it's jargon, you need to clarify it so that if a judge is there without your presence, they can still understand and read these graphs. I also have these models, and models like these will go a long way with the judge. First of all, they're visually appealing, and second of all, they really clarify what's happening here. And then on this side, I have a diagram for my results and analysis that puts the quantitative data in really simple terms. And then I have things like my discussion, which is conclusion, limitations, and future research with models and stuff like that. I also have another example. This is one that I took to state, and this is more of a traditional trifold. It's not one board, it's like 1 1/4 or 1 1/3. So you can extend it a little bit, but if you're going to double board territory, then you're kind of far reaching it. So here it's a similar thing. I have like the background and the goals, the criteria, and the methodology. All on this slide I have my introduction, like I did in my previous one. This is all data, so these images are like how my model is working. And these graphs down here show the actual accuracy of my model. And then up here, same like, you can see my boards are pretty similar from year to year, but I have like another model showing the different analysis of the results found in my topic, and then down here is the discussion with things like future research and limitations. And then also another thing to note is your title should be pretty big up on your board. I should be able to see it from a considerable distance away, as well as if you have a long title for your board title, you can create a shortened version that makes it easier for a judge to approach your project. And then when you're considering things like font size, you want to keep a bigger font. I use 24 size font for my text, which is pretty big, but anywhere from 18 up is pretty good. And then for headings, you want to use something like 45 and up, 35 and up. And then for your title, you want a pretty big title. Yeah. Makes it easier for a judge to see.
And some quick clarifications. This is like a decent length for a title, but sometimes you'll see projects with like titles that are like 20, 30 words. And we don't want that here. We want to keep the actual central title of it like concise with enough information so the judge knows what you're talking about. And then if you want to add a subheading of what like that goes more in depth of what your project is, you can have like a short little subheading under it. But typically we want the title to be like less than 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, like less than 10 words.
And you can see like here, there's like, when you look at this board, you don't think words usually. You think there's like a lot of models and graphs and flow charts and stuff like that. And that's how you want your board to be. You want it to be less words and more models that make it easier for a judge to make. And you can see here another thing. After regionals, I realized that on the rubric there was a specific section for alternatives. So I decided to just put something with alternatives so that I cover that point in the rubric. And if you're conforming your presentation, your binder, your logbook, or your board, to the rubric, you're going to be pretty much set for in terms of like checking off those boxes during your presentation.
Is there another example? Sorry. Okay, so we've already gone a little bit into the research binder, and just like a quick recap, it's just a more detailed version of the board with all the typed data and information clearly listed out. And you want to include a table of content, which is really important, and clear sections that the judge can easily flip through so that they know all the information. Oh, you also include acknowledgements, like if a teacher or a professor or like a parent or a sibling helped you out, just like include an acknowledgement section at the end.
And then, like I said before, I like to follow this format called IMRED, which is Introduction, Materials Methodology, Results, Analysis, and Discussion. But in our previous slides from different meetings, you can see we have this like 10-point checklist of the entire project. And each of those checklists, it includes things like acknowledgements, introduction, purpose, materials, procedures. All of that should be in your board. Your board should, your binder. Your binder should be one of the most detailed things that you have up there. And that's going to be really important for showing if a judge wants to see really specific data or really specific analysis. Like if on your board, your conclusion might be bulleted, or your analysis might be bulleted, or shown in models. But in your binder, that should all be typed out like it's a formal report. So if you've ever done a research paper, something like that can be projected out and even more detailed into something like a binder.
Kevin, you want to talk about the abstract?
Sure. Yeah, so quick note on that title thing. It was really funny. There was this guy who literally put his abstract as his title, so don't do that. It was pretty much as long as that. So abstract, it is, as the presentation says, it's essentially their first impression of your projects. And a lot of times, you submit your abstract before you go into competition, and it's the first thing that judges read before you even get contact with them. So in this, you want to, of course, make it interesting and also make it easy to understand, but also outline very, very intentionally the key parts of your research. So number one, motivation. Why is this important? Number two, what did you do to solve this? Number three, a general outline of your methodology. So if you have like a big flow chart, it's good to summarize that in the abstract in terms of words. And then finally, this is a part that a lot of people don't emphasize enough, and that's results. You need to talk about, if you have a project that is, for example, improving upon the state of the art, you need to talk about X% over the state of the art, or a new methodology that establishes some new paradigm that people should be using in the future, or whatever it is. And then finally close with a strong ending, talking about why your research is so cool. So in general, yeah, it's not so much in detail such that people who are kind of in the field but kind of not, for example, and like, for example, a CS major who may not know about machine learning, they should also be able to understand your project. So keep it free of jargon, make it easy to understand, and that's really your main goal there.
And a lot of people with the abstract will kind of like copy-paste their introduction. But the abstract and the introduction are two like very different things. Introduction will be like, what's the problem, and kind of what's the solution.
Yeah.
But that will be like the first fourth of your abstract.
Just a couple lines. Like, people like to talk a lot about motivation in the abstract, and I think that it's more important to talk about what you did. Just one line.
And so it's going to be it's going to be just a little bit of the introduction. You have to introduce the problem, of course. But then it's going to be a lot of your what you did, which is methodology, and how it affected something, which is results and analysis. And then you have a little bit for conclusion as well. It's really just a really short overview of your entire project.
Okay, so this is going back to the elevator pitch that I mentioned earlier. It's just like a separate slide that we have for it. The elevator pitch, like I said, is the first thing that you say to your judge, and it's like a brief rundown of your project. And it shouldn't be too long, it should only be a few minutes long, depending on how much stuff you have in your project. But it should be pretty brief and give a good summary of your entire project. And it should be like, it should have enough background information, and it should be like, there should be not as steep of a learning curve, so that the fact that someone who has never heard of this project before, or someone who has never entered this field that you're going to talk about, can easily understand what you're saying. So you would want to avoid words like light inefficiency, and just say instead like how well it attaches to another molecule or something like that. So that someone that like maybe like 12 years old can understand your project, but also like strong enough so that like a 60-year-old professor would clearly understand what you're doing.
Yeah. And the main thing with the elevator pitch is to convince, not to teach. A lot of people try to teach their judges, for example, like why something works, like why waves propagate the way that they do, or whatever, how molecules attach. Not really that necessary, you just have to convince them that it is the way it is, and then if they have questions, because maybe you didn't explain it that well, or maybe they just are curious, they can talk to you in the interview session, or read your report, or whatever.
And then, like Kevin said with the abstract, people like to, in their abstract, emphasize the motivation. And people do the same thing with the elevator pitch. Should mention the motivation, but you really want to be talking about what you did and how it affected something, your methodology and results. Because you're only going to have a few minutes, so you want to keep it condensed, and you want to really allot the most amount of time to what you did. And the other important thing is you don't want to make your elevator pitch like a memorized speech. You want to be really flexible and malleable with your presentation, and you want to be able to read your judges, and we'll teach you how to do that in the upcoming meetings to see if they're interested or if they're confused or disinterested, so that you can morph your presentation to either emphasize certain points that, for example, if they're really heavy into algorithms and you're doing a project, then you might want to emphasize that part because you'll get more enticing questions later on. But if they're really confused on a certain point, a certain part of the project, and you can tell that, then you might want to emphasize explaining that part. So learning how to read your judges and morph your presentation to fit the audience is going to go a long way when in terms of convincing a judge that your project is important.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, the elevator pitch is just like the first part of the interview. It's essentially when they walk up to you and they're like, "Tell me about your project." Note that some judges don't do that. Some of them have so much experience in the field that they just come up to you and they start asking questions. So just go along with it, but be prepared to kind of hammer down whatever you wanted to tell them in the elevator pitch whenever you can in the rest of the interview.
Yeah.
But like it's just like any kind of interview, right?
And every judge is going to be different. Like most judges, I'll say, will come up and tell me about your project. They'll let you do your elevator pitch. Some will already know your project from pre-judging, and they'll just start asking you questions. But like I had a judge at State who walked up to my board, wouldn't let me do my elevator pitch, and just looked at my board for 5 to 6 minutes before starting to ask me questions. And you'd start talking, they go, "Oh no, hang on, let me look at the board." And then afterwards, while you're asking questions, if you can learn to incorporate really important things from your elevator pitch into the answering of your question, then you're golden. So learning how to morph to these different scenarios is going to go a long way.
Yeah, and then later on when we do like practice interviews with you guys, we're gonna try to have different like structures of interviews. So someone would be like, "Hey, tell me about your project," and another one of us would be like, "Ask questions right off the bat."
Yeah,
So
we'll do a wide variety of interview styles next meeting and over the next few like practice scenario. Most of our next seminars over the rest of the year basically are going to be solidifying and pounding down your presentation. Because if you can do a really good presentation, you've already done the research, but if you can put that into a really good presentation, then you're going to do really good at these competitions. So then here's the questioning phase. Questioning is probably, I'd say, it's as important, if not more important than the elevator speech. So the elevator speech is we're going to be giving out an overview of the project. But questioning can get really specific as well as really abstract. These judges can ask anything, and even if it's not like fully related to your category, if it's tangentially related to your project, then they can ask the question.
Oh no, I mean, yeah. Well, okay. So the thing with these judges is that don't worry about not knowing something if they tell you. So the first thing is that you should always be prepared. Everything that you put on your board, you must be able to explain. I had a friend who wrote out a proof for why gradient descent can converge for AI applications. He didn't know the proof, he just copied it from online. Luckily, he didn't get asked that question, but if he did, he would have, points would have been lost there. So the idea is that everything that you put on your board, make sure that you can explain it, make sure that you understand it, not just because it looks cool, so that when you come to the interview phase, you'll kind of expect it. And what you say by expecting, that kind of leads into the next thing. You need to be able to expect what kind of question that they will ask you, and especially like the tough ones. If you know your research very well, you'll of course be able to come up with questions that might throw you off or are very challenging to answer. So before you go into an interview, don't just think about, well, there are two components. Number one, you have to be prepared for both. Number one is the questions that they'll always ask you, like who helped you on your research, how'd you get this idea, etc. But there are also very specific ones that you'll want to be prepared for. For example, if you're doing a machine learning project, how do these algorithms converge? How did you build your model? How did you select all these things? If you're doing some kind of engineering project, why did you set the constraints and criteria to be the way that they are? So those are just some things to keep in mind.
Yeah, and like Kenneth said, you should know everything that's on your board, binder, logbook, and abstract, like the back of your hand. But when you're doing background research, and you should still be doing, background research is not just at the beginning, it's researching new and new things throughout your project. You should be learning things that aren't technically on your board or in your binder or on your in your presentation, but if a judge asks you, it's going to be somewhere, there's like this project, your project is here, and there's a cloud of things that a judge can ask around it. So you need to be able to know a very big variety of things around it. Because the more you know, the more impressive you're going to be to a judge. And then there are a lot of different strategies when it comes to answering questions. We have a mentor, his name is John. He likes to leave like gaps in his presentation, very subtle gaps that invite questions. And when they invite the question, he already knows how to pound down that question.
It's smart.
It's a really smart strategy that I never would have thought of.
It's also subtle too.
It's really subtle.
If you screw it up, you're
Yeah, you have to be really good at it. But the idea is during his main elevator pitch, he'll leave out something that a judge is most likely to ask because he's left it out. And he's practiced that question so that when that judge asks the question, he knows exactly the best response to that question. So it's kind of like a cheeky way of doing it. If you're not good at that kind of strategy, we wouldn't recommend it, but it's just a way of looking at it.
Well, I mean, that is actually highly related to something else I was going to say about the elevator pitch. Don't feel afraid to leave out stuff from your elevator pitch, especially in the details of the methodology that may or may not be interesting to your judge, in all honesty. Because what the judge, really what they want to know is, what did you do? Why is it important in terms of applications? Number 3, why should I care? And number 4, how is this different from anything that's been done before? Now, the methodology is just a way of convincing them. So again, don't try to teach them, convince them. So don't be afraid to leave out holes in your methodology. Not glaring holes, those are bad. But little details, don't be afraid to leave them out. You can come back to fill them in the interview section.
Yeah, and it sounds weird, but it's better to say less than more. If you say less, just the main parts of your project, then they're going to ask questions about things they're interested in, more specific. But if you say more and you bore them with the details, then while you're saying this long elevator speech, they're going to get uninterested, they're going to get disinterested, and they're just going to lose focus when you're presenting. That's basically it.
Wait, I think it's just the thing's broken. Oh wait, is that the end?
That's it.
Okay, okay, cool. So one point that we forgot to mention up here is avoid BS.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
Oh, I mean, yeah, just if you don't know something, you don't know it.
Yeah. Do not try, because a judge might like act like they don't know something,
Yeah, they will.
and they do know it, but they're just testing your knowledge on it. So if you BS something and you're wrong, then it's over. You've completely lost a big credibility point there. And if you somehow manage to BS it and you're right, it depends on your presentation skills there, because if it sounds like you're BSing something, then they can look right through it. If you're really good at presenting, you can get away with BSing, but still avoid it completely.
Right. This comes off a point where a lot of judges, well, I think it's mostly at the middle school level, but some judges are looking specifically on whether or not you did your project, or if like your parents or like some other person did your project. So they're going to ask you specific questions that you should know if you were the one that conducted a majority of this project. So that don't take that as like, oh, my parents shouldn't help me at all. Obviously your parents are a resource that like should be able to like assist you in certain parts. But be sure that you're doing the bulk of the work so that you know the majority of the information.
Right. The entire thing is convincing that you've A, done your project, and B, that your project is working. So convincing goes along with that honesty. When you in your presentation, you want to be able to show that your project is yours and it's worthy. And by invoking a certain presentational style, avoiding BS-ery, and really just improving the way that you're conveying an idea to a judge, you can easily do this.
Yeah. So that's pretty much it. Do you guys have any questions? No questions? Okay, cool.
Then we'll get into our mentorship.
Yeah, so we're going to get into our mentorship session. So before we do that, a couple of things. So I noticed that only a couple of you guys brought things. I mean, it's totally fine. Usually, that's the thing with science fair, right? And by extension, research, is that things don't always go the way that you expect them to, no matter whether it be with like your ideation or your engineering section or your scientific experimentation has gone wrong. It's totally normal. And I think one of the big ways that you can kind of get over that roadblock is to talk to people. And it doesn't have to be your direct family, it can be your friends, it can be the message portal on the website. So a lot of different things that you can do. So that's one of the reasons that we really want to push this kind of like mentorship, is to push you guys out to speak to different people. We try to meet you up with different people every time so that you can have a chance to talk to people about your ideas. So if you guys didn't bring anything today, that's totally fine. When you meet your mentor, just tell them that you don't have anything today, but just give them a little bit of an elevator pitch on what you've currently done. If you've already brought things, that's wonderful. We've already looked through all the things and we're ready to give you some comments. Anything else? Alright, great. So you guys can head over to that room and we'll get started. Thanks, guys.